The gavel cracked against the wood, sharp as thunder. The courtroom went still. Judge Beryl Howell leaned forward, her eyes cold, her voice dripping with authority. "Congresswoman Crockett," she said, each syllable a dagger, "you will not grandstand in my courtroom. You will respect this bench, or I will have no choice but to hold you in contempt." Gasps rippled through the chamber. The camera zoomed in. This wasn't just a hearing anymore. It was a showdown. Howell, cloaked in the power of her robe, was daring to make an example out of Jasmine Crockett, a freshman congresswoman underestimated by nearly everyone in Washington. To the casual observer, Crockett looked cornered, pinned between the rigid power of the judge and the unspoken weight of a system that had silenced so many before her. But Crockett wasn't like those who cowered. She sat tall, unflinching. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was calculation. Every heartbeat in the room seemed louder, every stare fixed on her. Reporters shifted in their seats, pens frozen above notepads, waiting for the spark that would ignite the firestorm. The tension wasn't just legal, it was cultural, generational, and deeply American. On one side, a judge determined to assert control, representing the old guard, the establishment, the machinery of order that too often turned a blind eye to injustice. On the other, a black woman from Texas who had clawed her way through law school, the courts, and the political battlefield, not to bow, but to rise. Judge Howell thought she was chastising a politician. What she didn't realize was that she had just handed the microphone to a lawyer with a mind sharp enough to cut steel. Crockett wasn't just a congresswoman, she was a legal genius, and this was her stage. The silence deepened. Even the cameras seemed to lean closer. Crockett raised her eyes slowly, locking onto Howell's with quiet fire. There was no fear, only poise. And then, with a calm that shook the room more than any shout could have, Jasmine Crockett parted her lips. What came next would not only dismantle the judge's attempt at humiliation, it would ripple far beyond the courtroom walls. Because Crockett wasn't about to defend herself. She was about to redefine the battle entirely. The headlines were already being drafted before Crockett even spoke. Judge Howell silences Congresswoman. Freshman lawmaker in hot water. The narrative was being written in real time, and the weight of that narrative was heavy. Because this wasn't just about a clash of personalities. It was about the story America tells itself about power, race, and truth. Judge Beryl Howell didn't just represent authority, she represented a system that for centuries had dismissed, minimized, or outright silenced women like Jasmine Crockett. From the bench, Howell's words carried the force of tradition, of law, of unquestioned dominance. And in that moment, it seemed the courtroom was a stage where history itself was trying to repeat. But here's what made the stakes so much higher. Jasmine Crockett wasn't only a politician, she was an attorney. She had spent years navigating the maze of legal codes and courtrooms, watching men in black robes lecture and scold, watching women fight twice as hard for half as much recognition. Crockett knew the rules better than anyone assumed, and she knew exactly how to wield them. The tension in the room mirrored the tension in the country. Outside those walls, millions of Americans were already grappling with questions of justice and fairness. Who gets to speak? Who gets to define order? And why, in the year 2025, do powerful figures still think they can belittle those who refuse to fit their mold? It was more than a legal exchange, it was symbolic warfare. Howell, secure in her position, had taken the risk of trying to put Crockett in her place. But Crockett had no intention of staying in that place. Every eye in the chamber, every lens on every camera, was waiting to see if she would fold or if she would rise. And the irony was staggering. Howell believed she was tightening control, but in reality, she had thrown open the gates. She had underestimated her opponent. She had mistaken Crockett's quiet for submission. What she had actually done was give Crockett the perfect opening, a chance to show America not only her resilience, but her brilliance. For Jasmine Crockett, this wasn't about ego. It wasn't about clapping back or scoring cheap political points. It was about principle. It was about showing every immigrant family, every young law student, every woman of color watching at home, that dignity could not be commanded into silence. It had to be earned. And Howell's attempt to strip it away only made Crockett's shine brighter. The atmosphere thickened. The crowd leaned in. Viewers at home felt their pulse quicken. There was something undeniably cinematic about what was unfolding. A battle of wills, a collision of old power and new courage. And like every great story, everyone could sense the twist coming. Because Crockett wasn't about to defend herself in the way Howell expected. She wasn't going to argue like a rattled politician scrambling to protect her image. She was going to argue like a lawyer, precise, strategic, unshakable. And as Howell glared down from the bench, convinced she had the upper hand, there was one truth she could not see. The next words out of Jasmine Crockett's mouth would turn the entire hearing upside down. The judge thought she was pressing her advantage. In reality, she was about to set the stage for one of the most unforgettable takedowns in modern political history. Before the gavel slammed in that tense courtroom, Judge Beryl Howell's reputation was already carved into the granite of Washington. To her allies, she was a force of discipline, unyielding, razor-sharp, a judge who brooked no nonsense. To her critics, she was a symbol of the system's arrogance, a figure who wrapped herself in the sanctity of law while quietly dismissing the humanity of those who stood before her. For decades, Howell had cultivated the image of authority. Every robe, every ruling, every raised eyebrow sent a message, "I am the law here." She had walked the marble halls of Washington long enough to believe that no one, no activist, no politician, no lawyer could shake her grip on control. In her courtroom, order wasn't just maintained, it was demanded. And yet, behind that stoic facade was a track record riddled with contradictions. Howell had spoken about fairness, yet critics pointed to her pattern of protecting the establishment. She had praised impartiality, yet her scoldings often seemed harsher when directed at those who challenged the very power structures she represented. She wore the robe as armor, using it not just to enforce law, but to silence those who dared to question its interpretation. What made Howell so formidable wasn't just her intellect, it was her confidence that the system itself would always protect her. Judges rarely face consequences in the public eye. Their words, sharp and final, usually vanish into transcripts that only lawyers and historians ever read. Howell thrived in that insulation. She believed the courtroom was her fortress, impenetrable by public outrage or political theater. But here's the irony. It was that very arrogance that set her up for a downfall. Because Howell, in her towering confidence, failed to recognize the power of the moment she had just walked into. The cameras weren't off. The audience wasn't lawyers flipping through dusty casebooks. No, this time, the courtroom was America's stage, and every word she spoke was broadcast, dissected, and replayed. She thought she was speaking down to one congresswoman. What she didn't realize was that she was also speaking down to millions who saw themselves in Jasmine Crockett. The immigrants, the outsiders, the women of color who had been told to sit down, to stay quiet, to know their place. And Howell's tone, sharp as it was, carried echoes of a history America still wrestles with. It wasn't just judicial authority. It was the sound of a gatekeeper trying to bar entry to someone who had earned her seat at the table. It was the sound of a system trying to reassert itself against the tidal wave of change. In Howell's mind, she was in control. She believed the courtroom dynamic was fixed. The judge commands, the accused obeys. What she didn't account for was Crockett's dual identity, not just as a congresswoman under scrutiny, but as a trained attorney who understood the rules of the game as well, if not better, than the judge herself. And this was the hidden flaw in Howell's strategy. She assumed Crockett's silence was surrender. She mistook composure for weakness. But silence, in Crockett's hands, was not retreat. It was the drawing of a bowstring, the pause before an arrow is released. The cracks in Howell's facade were invisible to her, but they were clear to everyone watching. The harder she tried to assert dominance, the more desperate it looked. The louder her scolding grew, the more it revealed fear. Not fear of Crockett herself, but of what Crockett represented, a new generation of leaders who refused to be cowed by tradition or title. And in that contrast lay the true drama. The judge who believed she was scripting a lesson in respect was in fact writing her own downfall. And the more she tried to tighten her grip, the closer she came to handing Crockett the stage. Because this wasn't going to be remembered as the day Judge Howell scolded a congresswoman. No, the world would remember it as the day Howell underestimated her opponent. And the moment Crockett opened her mouth, that underestimation would turn into one of the most explosive courtroom reversals ever caught on camera. Long before Jasmine Crockett walked into that courtroom, before the cameras turned her silence into suspense, she was already living proof of what happens when resilience meets opportunity. To understand why she sat so unshaken before Judge Beryl Howell, you have to know where she came from and why every insult, every dismissal, only sharpened her resolve. Born in St. Louis, Jasmine grew up in a working-class family that knew struggle firsthand. Her parents didn't hand her power, they handed her grit. They didn't give her privilege, they gave her perspective. Crockett's childhood was shaped by contradictions, hardship that could have broken her, but also community that lifted her up. She learned early that in America, the rules weren't written for everyone equally, and that if she wanted to rise, she'd have to know those rules better than anyone else. Law wasn't just a career choice for Crockett, it was a calling. She saw how the law could be a shield, but also how it was often wielded as a weapon against people who looked like her. That paradox lit a fire in her. She went on to law school, entering lecture halls where only a few faces looked like hers, listening to professors who sometimes spoke about justice as if it were an abstract concept instead of the daily fight her community lived. And yet, Crockett thrived. Not because it was easy, but because she refused to be invisible. She took internships that put her face to face with the harshest realities of the justice system. She defended clients who had no voice. She stood in courtrooms where the odds were stacked and found ways to carve cracks into the walls of inevitability. She wasn't just learning the law, she was weaponizing it. When she transitioned from the courtroom to the halls of Congress, skeptics underestimated her again. A young black woman from Texas stepping into Washington politics? They thought she would be swallowed whole. But Crockett was no stranger to entering arenas where she wasn't expected to win. She carried her community's stories with her, and every time she was told no, she sharpened her yes. Her rise wasn't meteoric, it was relentless. Every seat she won, every argument she made, was another brick laid in the foundation of a career built not on privilege, but on persistence. And that persistence gave her a different kind of confidence, the kind that doesn't need to shout, the kind that speaks volumes in silence. That's why when Judge Howell attempted to humiliate her, Crockett didn't flinch. She wasn't intimidated by authority, because she had spent her life staring down authority that dismissed her. She knew that power can be loud, but dignity is louder. What makes her story so potent is that Crockett embodies both sides of America, the one that tries to hold people back, and the one that rises anyway. She knows the sting of being underestimated. She knows the pride of proving doubters wrong. And she knows that every time she steps up, she isn't just representing herself, she's representing every young woman of color who's been told she's too much or not enough. Her presence in that courtroom was bigger than politics. It was generational, it was cultural, it was personal. Crockett wasn't just a congresswoman facing down a judge. She was a living reminder that the American dream doesn't belong to the privileged few. It belongs to anyone who dares to claim it. And in that moment, staring down Howell, she tapped into all of it. The late nights in law school, the grueling trials, the fights in Congress where her voice carried the weight of those who couldn't speak. She wasn't sitting in that courtroom as someone to be scolded. She was sitting there as someone who had earned her place, step by painful step. Judge Howell didn't know that. She thought she was addressing a politician, a rookie congresswoman who could be cowed into compliance. But Crockett wasn't just a politician. She was a legal mind sharpened by years of being doubted and dismissed. She was a fighter who knew that silence could be more powerful than outrage. She was a strategist who understood that sometimes the best way to win is to let your opponent think you're losing, right before you strike. And she would. Because what Judge Howell didn't realize was that she had just become the latest in a long line of authority figures who tried to box Jasmine Crockett in. And just like every time before, Crockett wasn't about to stay inside that box. She was about to break it wide open in front of a nation that was ready to see exactly who she was. The question hanging in the air wasn't whether Crockett would fight back. It was how and when. And the answer, as the cameras rolled and the silence thickened, was about to shock everyone who thought they already knew the ending to this story. Long before Jasmine Crockett walked into that courtroom, before the cameras turned her silence into suspense, she was already living proof of what happens when resilience meets opportunity. To understand why she sat so unshaken before Judge Beryl Howell, you have to know where she came from and why every insult, every dismissal only sharpened her resolve. Born in St. Louis, Jasmine grew up in a working-class family that knew struggle firsthand. Her parents didn't hand her power, they handed her grit. They didn't give her privilege, they gave her perspective. Crockett's childhood was shaped by contradictions, hardship that could have broken her, but also community that lifted her up. She learned early that in America, the rules weren't written for everyone equally, and that if she wanted to rise, she'd have to know those rules better than anyone else. Law wasn't just a career choice for Crockett. It was a calling. She saw how the law could be a shield, but also how it was often wielded as a weapon against people who looked like her. That paradox lit a fire in her. She went on to law school, entering lecture halls where only a few faces looked like hers, listening to professors who sometimes spoke about justice as if it were an abstract concept instead of the daily fight her community lived. And yet, Crockett thrived. Not because it was easy, but because she refused to be invisible. She took internships that put her face to face with the harshest realities of the justice system. She defended clients who had no voice. She stood in courtrooms where the odds were stacked and found ways to carve cracks into the walls of inevitability. She wasn't just learning the law, she was weaponizing it. When she transitioned from the courtroom to the halls of Congress, skeptics underestimated her again. A young black woman from Texas stepping into Washington politics, they thought she would be swallowed whole. But Crockett was no stranger to entering arenas where she wasn't expected to win. She carried her community's stories with her, and every time she was told no, she sharpened her yes. Her rise wasn't meteoric, it was relentless. Every seat she won, every argument she made, was another brick laid in the foundation of a career built not on privilege, but on persistence. And that persistence gave her a different kind of confidence, the kind that doesn't need to shout, the kind that speaks volumes in silence. That's why when Judge Beryl Howell attempted to humiliate her, Crockett didn't flinch. She wasn't intimidated by authority because she had spent her life staring down authority that dismissed her. She knew that power can be loud, but dignity is louder. What makes her story so potent is that Crockett embodies both sides of America, the one that tries to hold people back and the one that rises anyway. She knows the sting of being underestimated. She knows the pride of proving doubters wrong. And she knows that every time she steps up, she isn't just representing herself, she's representing every young woman of color who's been told she's too much or not enough. Her presence in that courtroom was bigger than politics. It was generational. It was cultural. It was personal. Crockett wasn't just a congresswoman facing down a judge. She was a living reminder that the American dream doesn't belong to the privileged few. It belongs to anyone who dares to claim it. And in that moment, staring down Howell, she tapped into it all. The late nights in law school, the grueling trials, the fights in Congress where her voice carried the weight of those who couldn't speak. She wasn't sitting in that courtroom as someone to be scolded. She was sitting there as someone who had earned her place, step by painful step. Judge Howell didn't know that. She thought she was addressing a politician, a rookie congresswoman who could be cowed into compliance. But Crockett wasn't just a politician. She was a legal mind sharpened by years of being doubted and dismissed. She was a fighter who knew that silence could be more powerful than outrage. She was a strategist who understood that sometimes the best way to win is to let your opponent think you're losing, right before you strike. And she would strike. Because what Judge Howell didn't realize was that she had just become the latest in a long line of authority figures who tried to box Jasmine Crockett in. And just like every time before, Crockett wasn't about to stay inside that box. She was about to break it wide open, in front of a nation that was ready to see exactly who she was. The question hanging in the air wasn't whether Crockett would fight back, it was how and when. And the answer, as the cameras rolled and the silence thickened, was about to shock everyone who thought they already knew the ending to this story. The air was thick with tension. Judge Howell's words still reverberated, the echo of her command meant to box Jasmine Crockett into silence. But silence was never Crockett's destiny. She straightened her posture, unflinching, her eyes locked on the bench. Then, with a tone that blended calm dignity and razor-edged precision, she began. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear enough to slice through the murmurs in the gallery. "You speak of respect for the law. Let me assure you, I respect it. I have dedicated my life to it. I have practiced it, upheld it, and defended it. And that is exactly why I cannot allow this courtroom to ignore its own standards." The gallery fell still. Even the shuffling of papers stopped. Crockett continued, her words deliberate, her pauses heavy. She was no longer reacting to Howell. She was commanding the room. "You see, Your Honor, I did not come here today as a defendant to be diminished. I came here as a representative of the people, sworn to protect their voices, sworn to defend the Constitution you claim to uphold. And with all due respect, the law is not your weapon. It is our shield. It belongs to every American, regardless of status, background, or identity." A ripple went through the gallery. Someone whispered, "She's turning it on her." Cameras zoomed tighter, hungry for every flicker of expression. Judge Howell stiffened, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Congresswoman," she began, but Crockett raised her hand ever so slightly, not in disrespect, but in quiet command. The audacity of it was breathtaking. "Respectfully, Your Honor," Crockett said, her voice steady, "I will not be silenced when truth is at stake. Because when you dismiss me, you are not just dismissing Jasmine Crockett. You are dismissing every immigrant family who fought for their place here. You are dismissing every black woman who has been told to stay in her place. You are dismissing every American who has been told that dignity is conditional." The words detonated like thunderclaps. The gallery gasped audibly, and social media feeds erupted in real time. Hashtags shot across the digital ether. Hashtag Crockett versus Howell. Hashtag legal genius. Hashtag mic drop moment. Howell's gavel came down sharply. Order! Order in this court! But the louder she demanded order, the clearer it became that order no longer belonged to her. It belonged to Crockett. And Crockett wasn't done. She leaned in, her voice intensifying, not with anger, but with conviction. "Your Honor, you accuse me of turning this into a circus, but let me be clear. The circus is not created by those who defend democracy. It is created by those who weaponize authority against truth, and I will not participate in that abuse by remaining silent." The words struck like lightning. For the first time, Howell blinked, her confidence shaken. Crockett pressed on, each word sharper, louder, more undeniable. "You tell me I am no different than any other defendant, but let me remind this court, every defendant has the right to due process. Every defendant has the right to be heard. Every defendant has the right to dignity. And yet, when I attempt to exercise those rights, I am cut off, dismissed, and belittled. Is that the justice you claim to represent?" The room was electric now. Even those who had walked in skeptical of Crockett found themselves nodding, clapping softly despite the gavel's warnings. Howell's attempts to assert dominance were crumbling under the sheer force of Crockett's truth. And then came the line, the one that would replay across every network, every feed, every phone screen in America. "You may wear the robe, Your Honor, but justice does not belong to you. Justice belongs to the people, and I will not apologize for standing on its side." The gallery erupted, unable to contain itself. Applause, gasps, even shouts of "That's right!" filled the chamber. Reporters looked at each other in disbelief. This wasn't a hearing anymore. This was history unfolding. Howell's gavel slammed again and again, her face flushed with frustration, but each slam was drowned out by the noise of a movement being born. Crockett's voice rose above it all, closing her counterattack not with defiance, but with inspiration. "This is not about Jasmine Crockett versus Judge Howell. This is about dignity versus arrogance. This is about law as a shield versus law as a weapon. This is about the America we all deserve, an America where no woman, no immigrant, no black American has to bow their head to power misused. And as long as I hold this seat, I will fight for that America. Whether it is here in this courtroom or on the floor of Congress, I will fight." By the time she finished, the gallery was on its feet. The judge's calls for order were meaningless. The narrative had flipped completely. The villain who thought she held the gavel was now exposed as rattled, overreaching, and out of touch. The hero who sat under fire had risen, unshaken, brilliant, undeniable. And though Howell still sat higher in the room, everyone knew who truly commanded the moment. Because Jasmine Crockett had just turned a courtroom trap into a battlefield victory. The gavel still echoed faintly in the chamber, but it was irrelevant. Judge Howell might have tried to restore control, yet everyone in the room knew control had already shifted. The moment Crockett declared that justice belonged to the people, something larger than the trial itself had been unleashed. Phones shot up like fireworks in the gallery, capturing every angle of her defiance. By the time Crockett left the courtroom, the world outside was already on fire with her words. On Twitter, hashtags blazed across the trending column. Hashtag Crockett versus Howell. Hashtag legal genius. Hashtag justice belongs to the people. Within an hour, clips of her speech had racked up millions of views. A single line, "You may wear the robe, but justice does not belong to you," became the rallying cry of a digital uprising. Commentators flooded the airwaves. On MSNBC, a panelist shook his head in awe. "I've covered hearings for 20 years. I have never seen someone dismantle a federal judge with that level of composure, clarity, and moral authority. Crockett didn't just win an argument, she redefined what it means to stand up for democracy in hostile territory." On Fox News, the reaction was defensive, almost frantic. Pundits accused Crockett of grandstanding and turning the courtroom into a political theater. But their words sounded hollow compared to the raw electricity of her speech, replaying in split screens right beside them. Even viewers could see it. One side was scrambling, the other was surging with momentum. Meanwhile, TikTok and Instagram Reels turned her courtroom takedown into viral soundbites. Gen Z activists stitched her words with protest footage, with captions like, "This is how you fight back." One reel showed a young immigrant student crying as she watched Crockett's clip, whispering, "She's speaking for us." The ripple effect stretched beyond social media. That very evening, Congress members from across the aisle were forced to weigh in. Some Republicans doubled down, calling Crockett disrespectful and out of line, but progressive leaders and moderates alike praised her courage. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted, "Jasmine Crockett just gave America a masterclass in how to confront power with dignity. Proud to stand with her." Even celebrities chimed in. Viola Davis posted the clip with a single caption, "Queen Energy." John Legend shared it with the line, "This is the America we fight for." The cultural momentum was undeniable. Crockett's courtroom moment was now a national conversation. But perhaps the most telling reaction came not from politicians or celebrities, but from ordinary people. Letters poured into Crockett's office from across the country. A teacher in Detroit thanking her for showing her students that respect and strength can coexist. A veteran in Texas writing that Crockett reminded him why he fought overseas. An immigrant mother in California saying Crockett's words gave her daughter the courage to dream bigger. In barbershops, churches, classrooms, and kitchens, the debate replayed. Was Crockett out of line, or was she the only one brave enough to speak truth in a room designed to suppress it? That question spread like wildfire, pulling more and more people into her orbit. Even legal scholars weighed in. A Harvard professor remarked, "Whether one agrees with her or not, Crockett exposed an uncomfortable truth. Judicial power is not above scrutiny. That tension between authority and accountability is as old as the Republic." And the most striking thing? Judge Howell herself went silent. No interviews, no public statements. In the court of public opinion, silence spoke louder than words. It looked like retreat. It looked like defeat. Meanwhile, Crockett didn't gloat. Cameras caught her outside the courthouse, calm and measured, telling reporters, "I didn't come here to win applause. I came here to stand for dignity, for law, and for the people who put me in this seat. That's my duty, and I will keep doing it no matter who sits across from me." That humility, that refusal to make it about herself, only deepened her resonance. She wasn't just a politician in a courtroom. She had become a symbol. By midnight, op-eds poured in with headlines like, "Crockett's courtroom showdown will define 2025 politics." "When justice belonged to the people, the Crockett moment." "From Congresswoman to icon, how one woman redefined the narrative." The tidal wave was undeniable. What had started as a tense attempt by Judge Howell to put Crockett in her place had backfired spectacularly. Instead, Crockett's place was now at the center of a national movement, a movement that was tired of arrogance cloaked in authority, tired of silence demanded in the face of disrespect, tired of the old rules that said justice was reserved for the powerful. And as America awoke to headlines blazing with her words, one question lingered everywhere. If Jasmine Crockett could hold her ground against a federal judge in that courtroom, what could she do on the biggest stage of all? The suspense was electric, because this clash was no longer confined to legal walls. It was spilling into politics, into culture, into the very future of America itself. And everyone knew the story was far from over. When the noise of trending hashtags and late-night commentary began to settle, what lingered wasn't just a courtroom clash. It was the deeper resonance of Jasmine Crockett's words. The idea that justice, dignity, and democracy don't belong to robes, gavels, or marble chambers. They belong to the people. For days, the clip replayed on every platform imaginable, and each replay felt less like a viral curiosity and more like a parable. Viewers weren't just watching Crockett stand her ground. They were watching themselves reflected in her defiance. Every immigrant who had ever been told to wait their turn. Every working parent who had felt invisible in a system that seemed rigged for the powerful. Every young activist who feared their voice wouldn't matter against centuries of entrenched authority. Crockett had cracked something open. She had shown that dignity isn't granted from above. It rises from below. And in that moment, her voice carried millions of others with it. Political analysts, usually cautious in their language, began calling her speech a generational touchstone. They compared it to Barbara Jordan's Watergate address, Shirley Chisholm's campaign declaration, and the fiery floor speeches of John Lewis. Each comparison carried the same message. Crockett was no longer simply reacting to a judge's insult. She was rewriting the script of who gets to speak for justice in America. But what struck people most was her calm restraint. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't spit venom, hadn't turned the moment into chaos. Instead, she used the very tools of the law, logic, precedent, and moral clarity, to remind the nation that democracy is not the property of gatekeepers. It is a covenant shared by all. In a sit-down interview days later, she explained, "I wasn't there to embarrass anyone. I was there to remind America of something we forget too often, that justice is not a gift, it's a responsibility. And every time we let arrogance go unchecked, we risk losing it." Those words landed like an echo chamber across the country. They were shared in classrooms, replayed in community meetings, and highlighted in sermons. Crockett's insistence that justice is a responsibility began to feel less like a slogan and more like a challenge to every citizen, every voter, every community. And that was the power of her moment. It didn't just expose arrogance, it inspired accountability. It reminded people that their voices matter, not someday, not after permission, but now. Even critics, grudging in their tone, had to admit that she had struck a chord. One conservative columnist wrote, "Whether you love her or despise her, Crockett has tapped into something real. People feel dismissed, they feel condescended to, and when she fired back at Howell, they felt seen. That is a political force far stronger than partisanship." In the end, Crockett's showdown with Judge Howell wasn't remembered as a courtroom spat. It was remembered as a clarion call. It reframed the battle lines not as judge versus congresswoman or left versus right, but as dignity versus contempt, people versus power unchecked. And that's why the story spread beyond politics. Parents told their kids about it as a lesson in courage. Teachers replayed the clip to show students that strength doesn't always mean shouting. It can mean holding steady when someone tries to belittle you. Immigrants saw in Crockett a reflection of their own resilience, a reminder that their stories too belong in America's narrative. Her words became a mirror for a restless country. They asked, what do you do when power tries to silence you? Do you shrink, or do you, like Crockett, rise? By the week's end, editorial boards were already calling her the conscience of the courtroom. And while some wondered what political doors might open for her next, others insisted the more important point was the moral one. Crockett had reminded America that the measure of a democracy isn't how the powerful speak, it's how the people answer back. In that truth lay the heart of the lesson. Justice isn't the domain of judges or politicians. It belongs to every voice willing to stand tall against arrogance, to every citizen brave enough to demand more, to every generation bold enough to carry the covenant forward. And so, long after the headlines fade and the hashtags disappear, Crockett's words endure, not just as a moment in history, but as a promise that dignity will always outlast contempt, that truth will always outshine arrogance, and that America, at its best, belongs not to the few, but to the many. Because justice, as she declared, does not belong to robes or gavels. It belongs to the people, and the people are ready. And so, what began as Judge Beryl Howell's attempt to put Jasmine Crockett in her place ended with the opposite result. The robe and the gavel lost their power in that moment. What remained was a truth so simple yet so powerful that it echoed beyond the courtroom. Justice belongs to the people. Crockett didn't just defend herself. She defended every person who has ever felt silenced, dismissed, or underestimated. She turned an attempt at humiliation into a lesson in courage. She reminded us all that dignity isn't given, it's claimed. That's why this moment matters. It wasn't just a legal skirmish. It was a story about America itself, about whether we allow arrogance to go unchecked or whether we rise to meet it with clarity, composure, and truth. Crockett showed us what it looks like to rise. And now the question is, will we? Because her story doesn't end here. Every viewer who hears her words becomes part of that legacy. Every share, every conversation, every moment you choose to stand tall in your own life keeps that flame alive. So if you felt inspired by what Jasmine Crockett did, if you believe in dignity over arrogance, people over power, don't just watch this story, be part of it. Subscribe for more stories that reveal the truth behind the headlines. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded of their own strength. And add your voice, because this movement doesn't grow in silence. It grows when we stand together. In the end, Crockett's message is bigger than politics. It's about who we are and who we can be. And that's a story worth telling again and again and again.